he actually wrote a note to the company. It got picked up in Medium, and it was basically called "Don't Fuck Up the Culture." And he basically, that's your job description: don't fuck up the culture.
That's so interesting.
And I was like, I'm all over that.
Hey everyone, I'm Suman, the CEO and co-founder of Marco. This is, well, it's not the first episode because we used to have this podcast called The Future of Culture, and we're going to figure out the branding. But essentially, what Marco does is we help companies connect their people through intentional experiences. That could be virtually, in person, through offsites. We're a connection company. Thesis being now more than ever, it's harder to connect your people in this more distributed world. And one of the things we started to do was we work with a lot of people leaders. So we wanted to tell their stories, first of all, just to talk about their companies, how they perhaps turn their companies into communities. And then also kind of in this new future of work era, kind of discuss how they're employing certain strategies and tactics in this kind of new way of working and living. So we have here an amazing guest who flew in from San Francisco. We're recording this in New York City. Mark Levy, who I'll give the quick background on Mark, but then I would love for you to share your background. Sure. But he's been a people leader at various companies ranging from Levi's to Airbnb, where he ran global employee experience and kind of was a part of the shift of HR towards employee experience, and has gone on to advise some amazing companies. So he's also joining Marco as an advisor, which we're super excited about, sharing his wealth of knowledge on what employee experience means. And so he was a part of an event we did yesterday with a bunch of people leaders from various companies, a lot of whom he has kind of worked with or collaborated with. So with that, Mark, how's it going?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. How's the
double header last night? Double header today. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so maybe we start with what did we do? What did we do last night?
Sure. I mean, it actually started with an event that Marco had in San Francisco.
Yeah.
At this very cool vibed place.
We love
What's
a cool vibe.
Mr.
Tipples.
Mr. Tipples.
Yeah. It's one of my favorite jazz bars in San Francisco.
Yeah, it's very cool. And brought together people leaders there to really, well, first of all, to connect, because people have been separated post-pandemic, just getting their act together and dealing with what goes on day to day at this difficult time for people leaders. And it was hosted by you all, and there was an amazing speaker, Chris.
Yeah.
Who you want to talk about, Chris?
Yeah. So Chris Schembra is an author and a facilitator. So he wrote 2 books called Gratitude and Pasta and Gratitude Through Hard Times. And he basically also is very passionate about connecting folks and kind of creating these vulnerable, authentic spaces where people can actually be humans and kind of show up. And so it was pretty cool because a lot of people who didn't know each other, and we kind of dove into kind of, how do you actually show up in this challenging time as a leader. So you came to that event.
Yeah, and Chris is just also an amazing human being. And so he really can quickly get the room to open up and be vulnerable, talk about themselves, what's going on, and then quickly through some exercises create some incredible connection.
Yeah.
And so that was what inspired me after having met you but never been to an experience yet.
Yeah.
To really go deeper, and you invited me out here, and
I basically texted you. I was like, "Hey, by the way, would you be down to fly to New York?" And you graciously accepted. So
well, and it was fun because I felt like it was about creating connections, but it was also a little selfish because I was creating reconnections with a lot of my folks out here in New York, and it was fun to have them meet each other to see what you all do and to actually go through the experience as well.
Yeah, amazing. So I guess maybe we can start off. One of the things we want to do, there's a lot of content out there, a lot of podcasts, a lot of people talking about specific kind of HR tools, strategies. Really, I would love to get a picture kind of under the hood of companies. And so you've worked at a number of companies. I think Airbnb is a brand name that everyone kind of knows about. And I think the co-founders created this amazing culture as well as an incredible company that's lasted this kind of decades, I guess at this point. You were a big part of that. So perhaps I think also special companies turn their companies into communities.
Exactly.
And so could you just talk a little bit about, well, I guess your professional experience and touch on Airbnb.
Sure.
As well.
I mean, I've been in human resources for longer than I'd like to say. Used to have hair. And I was never that proud of the profession, to be honest with you. I felt like there was a lot of people in HR who were making rules, holding people accountable. People were scared of them. They didn't trust them. And all through my career, I was all around, how do I understand the business? How do I help really empower the employees to be their best selves? How do I get them closer to the customer? How do I help them to be proud of the company? And I learned a lot, I would say, I learned a lot from some people who weren't great HR leaders.
Yeah.
And then I learned some from HR leaders that really kind of taught me some new ways of thinking. But mostly I learned from some incredible business leaders who valued employees and who understood how to communicate, how to create connections, et cetera. And through my time at Best Buy and Levi's and Gap, and then I spent 2.5 years in Paris, which was super interesting to see how that's a whole. I mean, they brought me over to Paris to this company called Thompson, which is now called Technicolor, because they wanted me to show them what good looked like. And then I got there and they didn't really care, because in Paris or in France or in Europe even, it's very much about the Comité d'Entreprise or the Works Council. It's very hierarchical. Discrimination over there is really around educational discrimination. They hire to where they went to school.
Yeah.
So it's a whole different thing. But when I came back, I was very excited because I got to use what I learned in being in a global company and outside of the U.S. And when I was interviewing at Airbnb, I remember Brian Chesky said to me, I don't really know what HR is, but everything I've heard about it, I don't like. So I don't want to call it human resources, and I don't want to act like other people having done human resources. Are you down for that? And I'm like, absolutely. I feel like I've been an imposter my whole life. So, basically he said, we feel like we've created a really amazing culture and we're going to grow big, and we want your help to scale that. And he'd just written this interesting article. He actually wrote a note to the company. It got picked up in Medium, and it was basically called "Don't Fuck Up the Culture." And he basically, that's your job description. Don't fuck up the culture.
That's so interesting.
And I was like, I'm all over that. So I said, well, let's not just call it something different. Let's do something different. So essentially, we got to a place by calling it employee experience, because I said, well, you have a customer experience team, and their sole thing is to focus on the experience the customer's having. And there's a strong connection between the customer's happiness, satisfaction, what you're delivering. Are you focused on the promise that you are stating, with the way that you treat your employees? So if you treat your employees the way you want them to treat the customer, there's this beautiful virtuous cycle. So I said, why don't we call it employee experience?
So you kind of helped coin that.
We made it up, to be honest with you.
And everyone uses it now.
Everyone uses it. I should have trademarked it or patented it or something. I would have been a lot wealthier, could have stopped working. But yeah, I mean, and we did it completely out of wanting to do something different and to focus on the culture. And to be honest, we didn't really codify what it was or know what we were doing. We just knew we wanted to do it differently. And the main thing we were trying to do was to do things with and for our employees, not to them. And it was all about this idea of co-creation, kind of human-centered design. And so we made sure that anything we did with our employees. They were involved in helping us to prioritize what we should be focused on, and they were involved in helping us to then design the solutions for how we were going to address whatever was getting in the way of them being successful, whether that was as an individual, as a team member, as a person who is trying to deliver on the company promise.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
So many things to unpack. I just one quick question. How did you meet Brian in the first place?
Well, this is a kind of a funny story. So I was friends with a woman who has this amazing recruiting firm. Her name's Jana Rich, Rich Talent Group. And they had called me and asked me to go interview at Pinterest. So I got all ready for that, researched, and I thought, first I got to figure out what the hell Princess is, because I had never really used it, and I didn't quite get it because it's, it is what it is. But I'm like, I don't understand how they make money, and back then they didn't either.
Yeah,
so,
they hadn't figured out the ad structure yet.
And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna wing this, and so I was all set. I'd done my research. I was all ready to go, and then literally like an hour before the interview, Kate, who was at Rich Talent Group, who ended up actually going to work at Lyft, called me and said, I feel really badly, but it turns out that they met someone in tech. And that was the whole thing. Well, you don't have any tech experience. I'm like, yeah, but I have tons of hospitality experience. I mean, I was a travel agent. I worked at a hotel company. It was my first job after I got my JD MBA. And they're like, they were looking for someone from tech. They fell in love with this person. I'm sorry, but you're not going. And so I was like, oh, darn. And I'm like, I get it. It's okay. Keep me in mind. And it was a giant lesson of don't get pissed, keep your cool. And because the following week she calls and goes, I think I have a better job for you. And so she introduced me to the folks at Airbnb. And then actually when I was there, since Brian didn't really know what HR was,
That's amazing. That's just
he was the hiring manager, but he had this guy named Chip Conley who was really kind of responsible for doing the hiring of the role. And Chip is an amazing human being, a great author. He had started Joie de Vie Hotels, which he had sold to Hyatt. He'd written some great books and continues to do that. Recently he's opened the Modern Elder Academy in Todos Santos, Mexico, and I've done some work with him.
We'll have to go out there and check it out.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, he and I, this is a little bit flash forward, but he and I are co-facilitating a week experience down there at his academy next June. And it's just going to be an Airbnb alumni week.
Wow.
So we're bringing people back, and it's just a way to continue the connections. But anyway, I digress. Chip was kind of somewhat babysitting the folks that you would call human resources, particularly the folks in learning. And so he was the one who was kind of responsible for the interview. He and I had a close friend in common that I'd gone to college with. And he was in his 50s like me, and everyone else at the company was in their 20s. And so it was kind of interesting because he said, he goes, I feel weird saying this. You might be a little old for the job, but so am I. So he said, and you have a very millennial resume, because I kind of had moved from one place to the next, and I kind of let my heart lead how I was choosing where I worked. And if my values were compromised or I didn't feel like I was still learning or growing, I was moving on. So he thought that might play in well. And I just worked for Lander Associates, which was a creative brand agency. And 2 of the 3 founders at Airbnb were from RISD. So they had this creative bent and really strong creative approach to how they were designing the company. And I think between that, my hospitality, and then this craving that I had to really focus on culture versus just pure HR, got me the role, and I'm grateful for it.
So did you fuck up the culture, or did you?
I did not fuck up the culture. I'll tell you a funny story. So, so when I got there was this group that was called Ground Control, and they were kind of a so they were kind of a self-organized team led by this amazing woman, Jenna Kushner, and they basically were people who were culture curators. And they were folks who were in facilities or admin assistants, or they had kind of administrative, operational type roles. And they came together and just said, you know what? The special thing about this company is its culture. Why don't we create this organization and let's be the ones who they weren't cheerleaders. They were like the ones who like put the breadcrumbs out, and then people consume those, and they were able to help kind of further define the values that Brian, Joe, and Nate had set out when they started. And they really focused on employee events, employee recognition, employee celebration, internal comms, mission and values. And they were what was special about that place. And I latched onto them big time. And they were an important part of what we called employee experience. So it was like it was your traditional HR functions plus ground control, plus this other group. I basically brought together facilities and real estate. We ended up calling it workplace. And then we added social impact as part of this employee experience group. And that's what made up the group.
So I'm going to get back to that because I have questions on that.
Sure.
But we were talking yesterday, and we're pretty passionate about connection, as I said at the beginning of this conversation. And you spoke at the event, and you talked about the different ways that you kind of thought about connection within Airbnb. What were those?
Yeah. So when I was there, one of the things that we found out was that it was not so much about the home, it was about the host and the experience. And so we did a bunch of work around the brand and worked with an amazing guy named Douglas Aiken, who had done a lot of work around cult-like cultures. And his ethnography work really said, you know what, this isn't... So the mission when I got there was around creating a home anywhere that you felt like you could go. And that translated into this idea around being home and this local and authentic experience that you'd have when you went places. But we realized it wasn't about the home, it was about the host. And so we made this shift towards a new mission, which is around creating a world where anyone could belong anywhere. And so belonging was like this core to it. In fact, it's funny, I was working out this morning and I looked at this bracelet that I have on that has belong on it. And we handed it out at this event we had when we kicked off Airbnb Experiences, which was the second business. Homes was the first, Experiences was the second. And God, I'm all over the place, I apologize. But one of the things around connections, what we realized was it was important to bring our employees together. So every year, 12 months or so, we would bring all of our employees together. It was called One Airbnb. And I remember when I started, Jenna, who I referred to, the head of global ground control, said to me, by the way, you're going into an e-staff meeting. You need to close the deal on this One Airbnb thing. It's happening in February, but I don't know if the whole e-staff's on board yet. And I'm like, okay. And she goes, and Chip's the one who's been kind of pioneering it. I'm like, okay. So I get in there thinking, okay, my job is to say, okay, we're doing this in February. And I get in there and there's a whole bunch of people who are like, what the fuck? This is going to cost a shit ton of money. And who said we're doing this? And I'm like, okay, I was really set up for failure on this one. But Chip came in and he's like, we're doing this. This is important. We've got people all over the world now. I mean, we only had 400 people, but they were we had 22 offices almost. And so we ended up closing the deal on that and had the most amazing experience where we actually rolled out the new brand and told our employees about it, but it wasn't going public for like another 6 or 7 months. And that transpired into doing that more often. And then it transpired into employees being part of this Airbnb Open, which was where we brought our hosts together. And hosts and employees together at these offsites. And our employees were the host to the host at these events. So there was one of our values was around be a host. So anyway, that was an amazing opportunity. But back to your question, which is around belonging. So we made the shift to belonging. The employee experience kind of mantra or agenda or strategy was, okay, if we're going to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere, then our mission, our strategy needs to be to create a place where people feel like they belong. So that as employees, so that they can help our hosts understand what belonging is and create belonging to our guests. We're in a double-sided marketplace. What we called customers were our hosts because they were the ones, we didn't own one home, apartment, anything. They were the ones who created the experience for our guests. So belonging was kind of our Uber or overview or our umbrella, and then we had to figure out, well, how do we break that down, right? It was interesting when we hired a head of diversity, equity, inclusion. Before that was kind of what you called it. We were like, let's not call it a head of diversity. We called it a head of belonging. And so I remember Forbes had a whole article on how we changed the name of this job. So we were doing a lot, I guess, around changing.
I was about to say, you changed a few times.
So basically how we, or as I look back, how I now define what belonging is belonging really is around creating connections. And there's really 4 connections that we focused on. And the first connection was between the company and the employees. And that's really what I talked about, this idea of doing things with and for. So it was a lot around two-way dialogue. It was a lot around this idea of co-creation and human-centered design. And it was a lot around being vulnerable and giving up this idea that you have all the answers. You being the head of HR, or you being the CEO, you being the founders, you being the leaders, and really being open-minded to asking your employees what's important, getting them to help you to prioritize, where should we be spending the money, and then how the heck are we gonna create the right solutions to be able to then design our way into a better place to work, a better place to deliver on our company promise. So we spent a lot of time in that area, creating connections between the employees and the company. The second thing was around creating connections between employees, which is way, way more important now with remote and hybrid work. And we can talk about that for another podcast.
Yeah.
But what we did was said, okay, people pretty much know the people that they work with. We had these beautiful offices. People came because they really wanted to spend time there. Essentially, we used our employees to determine how to create offices that had the functionality of work, but the casual, wonderful, homey nature of your home.
I remember going to the Airbnb office in San Francisco.
Really special places.
Yeah.
And we brought in not only the feeling of home, but we actually were inspired by our hosts. So every one of the conference rooms and the cafes were inspired by an actual listing somewhere around the world. And so, you know, you'd meet in Copenhagen, you'd meet in Paris, and they were set up either like a living room or a dining room or a kitchen, depending on what kind of meeting you were having. I mean, and that followed through all the way to a place where food was an important thing because we brought together, it's kind of like Chris' story around pasta and dinners and connection. We thought food was really important. So we had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, fully complimentary. And each meal was inspired by a place around the world. So our kitchen staff was incredible hosts, but they also had to be super talented because they had to make meals from everywhere around the world, inspired by one of our places that we worked. And it's funny, I had some consultants come eat with us one day at lunch, and they're like, "Do you have a no laptop policy in the cafe?" And I said, "No, why?" And they're like, "Well, nobody's like working." I'm like, "Well, because this is a place for connection. People know that you know, lunchtime, whatever, breakfast, etc. Those are places to come and connect with each other. It's not a place, and you're doing work. You just don't have your head in a laptop."
Yeah, you might be having a conversation about your product launch or whatever it is, right?
And in fact, dinner was served at 6. And no one was expected to stay after dinner. And in fact, we encouraged our employees to bring their partners, their spouses, their kids, because again, we were wanting to be a place of connection, and we wanted people not have to worry about what you were going to make for dinner or how you're going to get home and be with the family. Just have them come in and meet you at the end of the day. So it's pretty cool. So anyway, again, I digress, but connections between employees was super important. And so it wasn't just the people you worked with, it was the people at Airbnb. And so we did things like had First Thursdays where employees offered up something that they were good at, a hobby or something that they did at work, and gave other people an opportunity to learn from each other. So it could be anything from margarita making to basic French to coding for idiots or whatever. But it was a way to meet people that you didn't know around something you were interested in. You know, we had very, very strong ERGs. They were very much involved in not just helping to create connections between folks in the ERG, but creating allies and also helping us to drive a better business. Like our ERGs helped us to realize that when we started experiences, we had to do it in a way that was much more inclusive. Mm-hmm. So we didn't start experiences in Los Angeles and Minneapolis. We started it in Detroit and Harlem. And we found ways to then not have yoga and wine tasting. We had really deep, interesting, culturally significant experiences that could help people to understand all parts of the world. And in fact, 10% of our experiences were either led by nonprofits or the money had to directly go to nonprofits. So we also brought the whole idea of social impact into it as well. So anyway, lots of ways we helped to create employees to connect, whether it was through the one Airbnb once a year, once every 12 months, bringing everyone together, or the first Thursdays. Anyway, so connections between employees and the company, connections between each other. The third one was connections between the employees and the customers. Again, for us, it was more the hosts and the guests. And so like we gave our employees $250 in travel credit every quarter, and they had the opportunity to travel wherever they wanted around the world. And we asked them to take a gift that we created, a host gift, and to invite the host where they were staying into their own home and talk about what it's like to be hosting on Airbnb, and ask questions around what is it like to work at Airbnb and how do we create more connections? How could they get more involved? A lot of the work that we did in public relations and in advocacy in the communities was through our hosts. You know, we had pretty large teams of folks that were trying to help communities around the world understand what the sharing economy was and how to be more open and accepting to Airbnb. But it was our hosts who were really out there advocating for themselves with their local governments. And so that was an interesting way that we got employees involved with our hosts. We had the one Airbnb, and we also had the Airbnb Open, again, where I said where employees hosted hosts at events to help them to be better hosts. We had portals for our hosts to get connected to each other through community involvement and through sharing. We had hosts who lived down the street from each other. Instead of seeing themselves as customers, saw themselves as partners. So if one was going out of town, the other could stay at their place while the other person hosted their home.
Wow.
So connections to the host or customer was the third one. And then the last one was connections to the communities in which they operate. Again, I could have a whole podcast on this, but we found social impact to be really important. We gave our employees 4 hours of a paid off volunteer time a month. And we encouraged our employees to get out and volunteer with each other, but also with hosts in the community, what was important to them, and get more involved in the community through the people that we were serving. And that was amazing. We ended up making social impact part of our onboarding process. So at the end of the first week, people would go and work at the San Francisco Food Bank with other folks that started that week. And boy, you talk about bringing the cohort together and creating a community. I still remember this guy who was a dishwasher in the kitchen with us. We were in the first cohort together. They went through the same program I did, and we packed food together, and we were friends, all the way until I left the company. And so we got involved in the community. We were part of the community. And like I said, we advocated in the community, and we had great opportunities to shift a lot of our programs towards social impact. So instead of company parties during the holidays, we got out and volunteered and gave back to families. Instead of having a bottle of champagne or watch at your years of service, we actually opened Benevity accounts for our employees, and then we funded their account based on the number of years they were at the company so that they could learn to give back. And this goes all the way to something I'm super proud of. After I left the company, while I was at the company, we realized alumni was an important part of the company because people wanted to feel like they belonged even after they left. And so we created a pretty strong alumni group. We have a very active alumni Slack channel that still exists. We brought our alumni back together to meet with the founders to keep them involved, try to create boomerangs. But the thing I'm most proud of is before the company went public, a number of employees, myself included, partnered with the Founders Pledge to advocate for our alumni, and then we actually went back into the company to consider giving back a percentage of what they were going to get when the company went public.
Wow.
And we ended up, at the time we went public, of having over 400 employees pledge over $40 million of what they were going to get from the IPO towards social impact of their choice. And there's a group alumni called Angel Investors, Airbnb Angels, that are giving back. So there's amazing ways that by creating this connection and giving people the opportunity to give back, that it goes beyond your time even at Airbnb. So those are the four. Wow, that was a long
that is epic. And there are so many points, I think, that I mean, just I haven't heard a lot of these stories, to be honest. So that's why this notion of like going under the hood,
Right?
because what you see is just a platform that's this amazing company,
Right.
But what you don't actually understand is how intentional the efforts were to create the culture that attracted the people that built the company,
Yeah.
that created the end result. But I'll try to touch on a few points in this question, which is, so you mentioned a lot of cool things. One is like this notion of what we talk about as rituals, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's certain things, First Thursday, for example, naming a conference room a certain name or having a certain food in your office. All of that is pretty intentional. Also, we're in this world now where a lot of work is pretty transactional, I think. You're just on back-to-back Zoom meetings. You don't have that opportunity. You're not going to name the Zoom room
Right.
Paris. So, and then we're also in a tough macroeconomic condition where people are thinking about how to spend money as they should. How do you think about how in this new way of working, especially if you're a new company, you don't have those rituals yet, why perhaps it's important to figure out how to build a culture of connection and how that might result in end result being business results, ROI,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, here's what I think would be the playbook. So
I'm going to take some notes on this.
Brian, Joe, and Nate, before they hired their first employee, said, what kind of company do we want to build? And how are we going to kind of plant the seeds for it to grow in that direction? And so while they might not have fully codified the values as we did when we were there, and then really, so anyway, I would say having that conversation early on before you even hire your first employee. And then to really then try to figure out what are the guardrails or what are the ways in which you're going to be thoughtful around making sure you stick to that. And or what are the ways, to use your word, intentionally you're going to say that's not really what we meant.
Yeah.
And or to find ways to really put the meat on the bones. So a couple things. We did some work using Pat Lencioni's The 6 Questions. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's an amazing way to create really defined things of kind of what's your North Star, what are the things that are important to you, what are your brand pillars, or the 3 things that if you ask these questions every time you were making a decision, you'd stay on track. Kind of what's most important right now, kind of what's your dashboard, and then how are you organized to make sure this is going to happen. Anyway, it's a great, so I would start with that conversation around what kind of company you want to build. Think about using something like the 6 questions to then create that framework. And then I think the next thing is to then figure out a way to make sure that you hire people who are joining for the right reason. So at Airbnb, we had these people who were called the core values interviewers. When we were small, it was Brian, Joe, and Nate that were the core value interviewers. And then it became a group of people who were really steeped in the culture. And the way it worked was that we had those folks interview people. They didn't know what job they were interviewing for. We tried to have someone interviewing them who weren't in the department that the person was being interviewed into, so you didn't have like job bias. And then we had very specific questions that we asked to determine to what extent we heard a signal that this person kind of lived and worked in the essence of our mission and values. So for example, the mission was around creating a world that anyone can belong anywhere. We would ask a question like, where was the last time you traveled? How did you choose to go there? And tell me about how you visited. And so, if someone was like, oh, I went to Jamaica and I stayed at this 5-star hotel and we never left the property and I love the Mai Tais or whatever. I'm like, okay, not the right person, right?
In Jamaica, you're not gonna
but if they're like, oh my God, I went to Jamaica and we ended up meeting these people at the river and they took us to their home and, everything doesn't have to be like so intense like that, but it's like, are you going somewhere to explore the culture and kind of live like a local, or are you going somewhere to, sunbathe and, hobnob? So anyway, so intentionality around hiring the right people. And so we would ask questions around the mission and the values, and we'd look for a signal for each. And if we had 2 people interviewing, and if both people said yes, the person got hired. And this was at the end of the interview process.
Yeah.
So they were always the most qualified person for the job, but they were also having to be somebody who was going to further our mission and values. If both people said no, the person didn't get hired. And I can tell you that went from admin to the CFO. And there was a certain time I remember we were looking for a CFO, and this woman came in to interview, and Brian was so infatuated with her because she claimed in her interview that she'd solved the financial crisis of 2008. I mean, she's a very bright person. And I have to tell you, she did not pass core values interviews, and she didn't get hired. So we're going to have a clear intentionality around the type of company you want to build. You're going to have these core values interviews you're going to hire towards. You're going to use the 6 questions to think about being clear around not just your values, but your strategy and your brand pillars and kind of how you're organized. And then I think what really codified things for us and democratized our values was to then translate your values into behaviors. Really clear understanding of what do you mean by that, and how do you see it, how do you feel it, how do you know it. And then in addition to core values interviewers, we had a core values council that helped our leadership team to decide and to help us to stay on track around things. Like I remember the marketing team decided that we were going to do a partnership with Snoop Dogg, and people were like, what the fuck? How is Snoop Dogg like anything close to what we're trying to do in the world, right? Or I remember we had a conversation because we had gone into vacation rentals around how, like, we thought vacation rentals couldn't be belonging because what we knew as vacation rentals were these like very turnkey places with not very well designed, and you didn't have a host and all that. But we found ways to make them our own, right? And so you have to figure out ways in which you can be open-minded. I mean, I remember we had a leadership offsite at my house in Mill Valley, and we were trying to figure out whether we should be going after business travel because we thought, oh, the guys in Dockers and loafers, they just want a hotel. They want a very soulless place to sit on their laptop and have a meal and go to meetings. And we did research and found out that actually business travelers were the loneliest travelers. And so
100%.
We ended up turning it around and creating a place that was business ready and, that had the keyless entry and had Wi-Fi that was, checked on, and that had a desk in each place. And so we like took these things and we
By the way, just an aside on that, I used to work in consulting at Bain, and I would stay at these super nice hotels, and everyone's like, that's so sick. And I hated it because it was just lonely. It's just
we ended up having people who are younger people like yourself who are in consulting firms are like, can we stay at Airbnb? And the travel advisor like, no, they're not safe. We don't have them on our platform. So it was people like you, again, talking about going to the people that can help change things, who came to us and said, here's what we would like. And then we went to you and said, how can we help change the travel policies? And so our business travel really came from people coming to us wanting to be able to use Airbnb while they were traveling.
Yeah.
So anyway, those were, and so then creating the behaviors that clarified the values, I would say would be the next thing. And then the Core Values Council helped us to make sure we stayed on track. So if we made bad decisions around partnerships, or they looked at things like any sort of organizational shift or change or acquisition and said, yeah, that seems like it's on point with our values, or no, that seems really like a bad choice. We would listen to them and they would help us to make the right decision. So how do you then create the intentionality, bring in the right people, and then democratize the culture, and then ensure that the decisions you make keep things going as you scale?
Yeah.
That's
it's just an observation is people, so I worked in tech and VC and all this kind of stuff, and people initially talk about how with the co-founders of Airbnb, they weren't technical, so they initially, it was hard to get funding, but they were incredible design thinkers, right? And so it seems like the values and all these things were the design thinking permeates through that.
For sure.
And the other observation is now as a founder, you're like, you think about like, how do I get money? How do I like get the seed round, the Series A, and how do I game the metrics and all this kind of stuff? But they were thinking about values from day one, which is totally different from what a lot of founders do. And I'm going to go back to my team after this and clarify.
I mean, here's a funny story. Well, there's a famous story that I won't repeat around when they went to Y Combinator, and they're like, if you don't have another idea, then you're fucked because and thanks for coming, but that was interesting. See you next time. And as they were walking out, Joe handed this box of Obama O's.
Obama O's, yeah.
And so they're like, holy shit, that's so interesting. That's so creative. And they ended up bringing him in because of the cereal they created. And then being a serial entrepreneur, spelled like the breakfast food, became one of the values of the company.
That's epic.
That's another example of how you can't just have values of integrity and, all the bullshit things that people have.
Kind of things that everyone has.
You've got to make it part of who you are and make it unique. And there's got to be stories behind it. And then they've got to just keep going.
Yeah.
But another kind of interesting form of creativity is we used to have 6 values, and we thought there's too many. We did a whole ethnography research and realized people only could remember 4. And one of the values was every frame matters, and the other one was simplicity. And the interesting thing was they were the ones we weren't doing well, so we decided let's focus on our core values, the ones that are most core to it. Those were more aspirational. But Every Frame Matters was based on Brian's infatuation for Disney, and it was really about the animators who painted or drew every single page in an animation. And his whole thing was around, you have to focus on every single specific detail so that every frame turns into this beautiful story.
That's incredible.
And it turned out the issue or challenge was people were like focused on perfection rather than on moving fast and breaking things. And so it really was getting in the way of us moving fast. So we thought, okay, let's get rid of that one. Plus it was more aspirational. The other one was simplicity. There was nothing simple about double-sided marketplace and a company that was doing something that was so totally different in a space of the sharing economy that people didn't understand. Mm-hmm. And in a situation where you didn't own one thing that you were kind of selling. And so we decided to shit can simplicity by using simplicity as a way to say, okay, if we're going to be simple, we should have 4, not 6
very meta.
values. And so it's interesting you talked about their creativity and their design thinking, but that was really what was behind a lot of what created Airbnb, for sure.
Okay, I could talk to you about Airbnb for hours is what I've realized. But so maybe we talk a little bit about what you've been up to after Airbnb and then perhaps touch on the employee experience manifesto, which I know you're working on.
Yeah. So, I mean, essentially, I left after about 4.5 years. We'd gone from hosts and homes to adding experiences. We were really starting to scale in a big way. And to be honest, at that time, there was a lot more around preparing for IPO and a lot of other things that were, to some extent, taking the eye off of the ball of employee experience. And I felt like maybe I was starting to overstay my welcome. And Chip, again, he brought me in and he actually helped me to leave, said, the stuff we've done here is really incredible. And I think it would be impressive for you to take that and share it with the world and to help people to figure out what we did and how do you make it something that others can learn about. And you're kind of at the peak of where you are and what we did. And maybe it's time for you to figure out how you take that on the road. So I ended up leaving.
Pretty noble of him, by the way. Pretty noble.
Yeah. He's a really incredible guy. We can talk about him too. But so I went out there and I'm like, all right, I don't know what I'm going to do next. I was kind of burnt out, but I was also super inspired to say, how can we help others to like bring this idea of belonging and humanity to their places of work. And it was interesting. Like my first 2 clients after I left, and I'll tell you, I never put a shingle up. I never spent 1 cent on advertising because what we had done at Airbnb was so interesting to people. In 2016, we won the Glassdoor Employer of the Year Award, which was really impressive because it's nothing that you apply for.
Yeah.
It's something that comes from your employees, which is so employee experience, right? To win an award on the fact that it was something the employees brought forward, not, that you applied for. So anyway, my first 2 clients were Kaylani, the performer, because I'd done some work with Arlen Hamilton, who started this incredible VC firm called Backstage Capital.
Oh yeah, Backstage
and
Capital.
her
Yeah.
story is amazing. She had nothing, and she's like, "This is wrong. That so much money is going to the white male," and so she started a VC firm where she gave seed money to what she calls underestimated founders. So women, people of color, and/or LGBTQ. She happened to be all three. And so Kaylani was someone who had this incredible following and was starting a company but didn't know the first thing about it. So I actually took the 6 questions, I remember, to her home with her 2 co-founders, and I asked them the questions, and they kind of looked at me like, where the fuck did you come from? and they were going to launch this thing called Flora, which was going to be her way of helping her fans to live a healthy life, which was a great idea. But they really hadn't thought it through. And so it was really nice that I was being able to help them to think through. I said, you only have one time that you can start, particularly when you have hundreds of thousands of followers. You're not like someone people don't know that could start a company and could flop and no one would know. You got to get your act together to launch this thing. The second client I had was KPMG.
Those are so diametrically opposed.
Because they had heard about employee experience and they flew me to London. I didn't even know what to charge. I remember I said, well, you tell me what I should charge because I've never been a consultant before. Totally undercharged them. So that was kind of a ripoff. But
That's
they
a
did
good
fly
pricing.
me to London.
That's a good pricing lesson.
They did fly me to London. And I helped them to think through what employee experience was and how they might think about doing that. And then anyway, from there, I would say, over the last 3 or 4 years, things evolved. I mean, basically my sweet spot was I ended up helping companies to look at their people and culture strategy, determine whether they were where they needed to be, help them make a shift towards employee experience. And a lot of times I'd help them determine whether the person who was leading HR was the right person to do that. And if not, I'd help them to then recruit and hire and mentor the person who was coming into role to really step into the role, understand what it was, help the CEO or founder understand what a great EX leader was, help that person understand how to create employee experience, and then to think about defining and scaling their culture. And essentially that's evolved over time. And now, to your point, what you said, I'm fortunate I don't have to work all the time, so I'm really trying to focus my attention either on underestimated founders, going back to Arlen Hamilton, because they don't have the same access to information and people and networks and all that, and have them really think like Brian, Joe, and Nate did around intentionality around their people and culture strategy and scaling. Or I'm also trying to help companies that are focused on social impact.
Yeah.
Throughout my career, and I did a TEDx on this, I just feel like giving back is something so important.
It's a great TEDx, by the way, for anyone who's...
Thanks. I feel like it's just so important and should be core to anyone, but it's got to be authentic, and you've got to do what you can at the stage that you're at. And so I'm working with great companies like Countable, which is helping people to amplify, educate, and embed their social impact strategy into their companies. But you brought up the EX manifesto. So about 2 years ago, I was contacted by a woman named Samantha Gadd, who's in New Zealand, a really fun, amazing, powerful, energetic Kiwi, who said, hey, this guy, Chris Tobin, he was the head of HR at a firm, somehow connected with me, and I asked him if he could connect me to you, because she said, like 8 years ago, I changed my whole approach to my consulting on HR and really made it more EX focused. But I realized everyone has bastardized the term employee experience, or not doing it the same way. And I feel like what you did at Airbnb and what I've been trying to do in my small consultancy in New Zealand is so important. Would you help me to figure out how we might codify employee experience into this manifesto? So I'm like, sure, that sounds great. And she had tons of energy, and I was kind of not all there to like really, like I said last night, I probably should have trademarked this thing, but I didn't.
Yeah.
And so I helped her to bring together a bunch of people. We met in Austin, Texas, where her business partner, Jenny Busing, lives. And we collectively co-created this thing called the Employee Experience Manifesto. And now it's out there. And I think over like 200 people all around the world have kind of made a pledge towards moving in this direction. And there's principles, there's values, and it really helps people to understand how you could either move towards this or improve on what you started at your organization to try and really apply the employee experience mindset and approach to what you're doing. And now they're actually doing an interesting thing where they've got some folks in tech, and they're helping to productize this thing and really move from what is currently like the employee engagement survey to an employee experience interactive technology that'll help you to get the information you need in order to prioritize and to design the solutions. And I probably shouldn't say any more than that because it's not really out there yet.
It is interesting just to think about the massive billion-dollar companies that do employee surveys that are done annually or biannually. Yeah. And that's the only check-in you have with how your people are doing.
And they served their purpose, and they went from like employee satisfaction to employee engagement. That was important. I mean, I remember back when I was at Best Buy, we used the Q12, which still is out there and is a really interesting tool, and to only ask 12 questions and get so much data. But what I've seen over time is, and like we did some really good work with Culture Amp when they were very young and starting, and they really moved the engagement survey from something that was a HR thing to something that was really getting data into the hands of the managers to be able to not only understand the data, but then to use the data to action on that. And I think that was big, from moving it from HR to manager and get the information you need at the time that you need it is important. And I think really the next phase now is to really give them information to the employees and get the information to the employees and give them the opportunity to help direct and to be involved, much more involved in the direction of the company and the things you're going to focus on and the ways you're going to design the solutions.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. There's some epic kind of insights and honestly just like great stories that you've shared. If you could close by imparting one piece of advice around, I'll frame this because I was doing a little bit of research on some of how you viewed how we should use employee experience or create it, and you talked about how it should be iterative, almost like an agile methodology.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so we're in this crazy new world. People know one thing I realized is people don't really know what they're doing. Even the most bright senior people leaders are figuring out because everything changes. What would you perhaps like impart on folks as we just to round us out on how to like move forward?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess the old way of doing things was really this idea that either the CEO or the co-founders or the head of HR had all the answers. And so you decided what was the priorities, you designed something, you shoved it into the organization, and the way you determined whether it was successful was whether people did it or not. So a perfect example is a new performance review or the employee engagement survey. Hooray, we got 90% people participating. Well, that really doesn't tell you to what extent you've moved the needle at all on what it is you're trying to do. So I would say the new way of doing things is to start closer to where the rubber meets the road, and that is the employees that are interfacing with the customers. Recently, I got asked to speak with the Emirates group with their global HR team. And on my way over there, they did an amazing job of making me feel special. I was on VIP. And
Emirates, like the airline.
Emirates, the airline, yeah.
And they have an epic flight experience, yeah.
Flight experience. But what I learned on the way over there, because I had this VIP flight attendant who was looking after me, and it's a 15-and-a-half-hour flight, so I couldn't sleep the whole time. She was chewing my ear on how they're on the forefront of creating this amazing customer experience, and they're the last to know things, and they don't ask them how they should run the company, and they put...
So she's giving it to you straight.
Yeah, giving it to me straight. And an interesting thing is like they put technology in place, and I'd flown Emirates once before, and I saw the difference. So they had like iPads on the plane, and what happened was, wow, okay, so they're more efficient, but their heads are in their iPads, and they're no longer looking at you and talking to you and calling you name and like treating you like a human.
Which is core to hospitality.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's a really interesting thing that like the people who are closest to the customer, they thought they were doing the right thing for them, but then they didn't ask them, is it working? And how can we help make your life better? How do we make the customer experience better? So I'd say start where the rubber meets the road, get them involved in prioritizing, have them be a part of designing the solution, and then don't put something in place and just assume it worked. Like, how many onboarding processes are stale because you did them, and then they all of a sudden, the pictures of the leaders are the wrong people because it's 3 years old, right? So it's got to be iterative. Just like we don't think about it when we get an update on our iPhone. We just upgrade. It just downloads. I drive a Tesla. I love that car. Don't love the company, but I love the car. But I don't think about it. I push the button, the next thing I know, whatever bug was there is gone. The same thing should be your performance management process or your onboarding process or your recruiting process. Just keep making it better. And you do that by asking those questions, getting involvement from your employees, and then iterating on things rather than just letting things sit still. And then you don't have this giant project of, we have to redo this program because it's not applicable anymore. So, those are kind of, I think, new ways of thinking about how both what you do and how you do it.
Epic. With that, that's a great way to end it. Cheers.
Thanks for having me.